What money are you talking about, Daniel? Margaret Whitmore asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she stood frozen in the doorway of her son's dining room, the scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon filling the air in a way that should have felt comforting but instead made her chest tighten, as if something invisible had shifted out of place. Daniel paused mid-slice with the carving knife hovering above the turkey, confusion spreading slowly across his face like a shadow. He couldn't quite understand. The transfers, Mom? The monthly deposits and the lake house paperwork I sent you 2 years ago, he said, his tone casual at first, almost proud, as though he expected gratitude. Margaret blinked once, then again, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. She had spent the last 2 years budgeting every dollar of her modest Social Security check, cutting pills in half to make prescriptions last longer, wearing the same wool coat through 2 harsh winters, telling herself that her son was busy building his life, and that she should not burden him. And yet here he was, talking about money that could have changed everything. Money that could have meant warmth instead of cold nights, and full meals instead of quiet hunger. She opened her mouth but no words came out at first, her mind scrambling to make sense of something that refused to fit. Across the table Victoria Whitmore sat perfectly still, her polished smile fixed just a little too tightly. Her fingers curled around the stem of her wine glass as though anchoring herself. Margaret noticed it in that moment, the way Victoria's eyes flickered briefly toward Daniel and then away. A small detail, almost nothing, but enough to send a ripple of unease through her. I never received anything, Margaret finally said, each word slow and careful as if speaking too quickly might shatter the fragile calm of the room. The silence that followed was immediate and heavy, the kind that presses down on a person's chest. Daniel's brow furrowed deeper now, the easy confidence gone from his posture. That's not possible, he said, more to himself than to her, already reaching for his phone as though technology could resolve what felt like a crack forming in the foundation of something much larger. Margaret stood there, watching her son scroll through emails and confirmations, her heart beating harder with each passing second, because if what he was saying was true, then the life she had been living, the quiet sacrifices, the nights spent wondering how she would make it through the month, none of it had been necessary, none of it should have happened, and that meant something else had been happening instead, something hidden, something deliberate. She slowly moved to the edge of the table and lowered herself into the chair, her movements controlled, almost detached, as though she were observing someone else's life from a distance. Victoria shifted in her seat, crossing her legs, uncrossing them, lifting her glass but not drinking, the small restless gestures adding up in Margaret's mind like pieces of a puzzle she had not known she was solving until now. The room that had moments ago felt warm and festive now seemed colder, sharper, every glance and every pause carrying a weight it hadn't before. Margaret folded her hands neatly in her lap, her expression calm despite the storm building quietly beneath the surface, because for the first time, she was not just confused, she was beginning to understand that something had been taken from her, and that the truth was sitting at this table, waiting to be uncovered. Daniel's fingers moved faster across his phone screen now, the glow of it reflecting in his eyes as he scrolled through transaction records and confirmation emails, each swipe sharpening the tension that had settled over the table. Margaret watched him quietly, her breathing steady even though her thoughts were anything but, because as he searched for proof, she found herself searching her own memories, retracing the past 2 years with a clarity that had not been there before. She saw herself standing in the pharmacy line counting out exact change, apologizing softly to the cashier when she had to put one item back. She remembered the winter mornings when the radiator in her small apartment barely warmed the room, and she kept her coat on indoors, telling herself it was not so bad, that she had lived through harder times. She remembered every moment she had chosen not to call Daniel, not to ask for help, because she believed he was already doing everything he could, because she believed that was what a good mother did. She swallowed slowly, her gaze shifting toward Victoria again, who now sat unnaturally still, her earlier composure beginning to crack in subtle ways. Her smile had faded, replaced by something tighter, more controlled. Her eyes flicked once more toward Daniel's phone, then down at the table as if avoiding something she could no longer ignore. "Here," Daniel said suddenly, turning the phone toward Margaret. His voice strained with confusion. These are the transfers. Every month.
$1,500.
Set up automatically. You should have been receiving them since your birthday 2 years ago. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the edge of the table, and looked at the screen. The numbers were clear, undeniable. Dates lined up month after month, a steady pattern of support that she had never seen, never touched, never benefited from. She felt a quiet shift inside her. Not panic, not anger, but something colder, something that settled deep and firm. I never saw any of this, she said, her tone calm but certain. Daniel shook his head slowly, disbelief written across his face. That cannot be right. I had everything handled. I made sure it was all set up properly. His voice trailed off as his certainty began to unravel. The room seemed to hold its breath again, and in that silence, Margaret noticed another detail. Victoria's hand had moved to her necklace, fingers brushing against it repeatedly in a small, nervous motion. It was the kind of gesture most people would overlook. But Margaret did not overlook it. Not anymore. Because now every small thing felt like it mattered. Every glance, every pause, every shift in tone. She leaned back slightly in her chair, her posture composed, almost distant, as if she had stepped outside the moment to observe it more clearly. Daniel, she said gently, who handled the paperwork? It was a simple question, but it carried weight. Daniel hesitated for just a fraction of a second before answering. My assistant prepared everything, but Victoria helped coordinate some of the details, especially the mailing address and the documents. His words hung in the air, and this time, when Margaret looked at Victoria, she did not look away. Victoria met her gaze briefly, then quickly reached for her glass again, taking a sip she did not seem to need. The silence stretched longer now, no longer confused but charged, and Margaret felt it settle fully into place, the understanding she had been circling since the moment Daniel first spoke, the realization that the life she had accepted, the hardship she had endured, had not been an accident or misfortune, but the result of something far more deliberate, and for the first time, she was no longer simply trying to understand what had happened, she was beginning to see exactly where to look. Daniel lowered his phone slowly, as if the weight of what he was seeing had begun to register in a way he could not immediately explain. His earlier certainty replaced by something far less stable, something closer to doubt. Margaret watched him without speaking, her eyes steady, her expression calm in a way that might have seemed passive to anyone who did not know her. But beneath that calm, her mind was moving with quiet precision, assembling the pieces that had once seemed disconnected. She remembered the phone calls that always felt rushed whenever Victoria answered instead of Daniel, the polite but firm way conversations would be redirected, shortened, or ended before she could say much of anything. She remembered the birthday card Daniel had mentioned sending, the one that never arrived, and the way Victoria had laughed it off weeks later, suggesting it must have been lost in the mail. At the time, Margaret had accepted that explanation without question, because it was easier to believe in small accidents than in something intentional. But now those small moments lined up differently, forming a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Victoria, Daniel said carefully, turning his attention toward his wife. His voice measured but no longer relaxed. You helped with the mailing address, right? You made sure everything was correct. Victoria looked up, her expression composed but her eyes slightly too bright. Of course I did. Daniel, everything was handled exactly the way your assistant instructed. She replied smoothly, but there was a slight delay before she spoke, just enough to make the words feel practiced rather than natural. Daniel frowned, not fully convinced but not yet ready to confront what that hesitation might mean. Margaret shifted slightly in her chair, folding her hands together again, her gaze never leaving Victoria, because now that she had started to look, she could not stop seeing the small inconsistencies, the careful phrasing, the subtle avoidance. Then how do you explain this? Daniel asked, holding up his phone again, his voice firmer now. Every single payment went through. The account numbers match. The confirmations are all here. But Mom says she never received anything. The room seemed to tighten around the question, as if even the walls were waiting for the answer. Victoria let out a soft breath, shaking her head slightly. There has to be some kind of error. Maybe the bank made a mistake or something got flagged and held, she said. Her tone still controlled but carrying a faint edge that had not been there before. Margaret listened without interrupting, her silence no longer uncertain but deliberate, because she understood now that speaking too soon would only give Victoria more room to maneuver. Instead she observed the way Victoria avoided looking directly at Daniel for more than a second at a time, the way her fingers tightened around the glass again, the way her voice remained smooth while her posture betrayed tension. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, frustration beginning to replace confusion. A mistake for 2 years. That does not make any sense, he said, more sharply now, and for the first time, there was a hint of something else in his voice, something that sounded like suspicion. Margaret felt that shift as clearly as if it had been spoken aloud, and she leaned back slightly, allowing the moment to unfold without interference, because this was no longer about convincing anyone of anything. The truth was already there, pressing against the surface, waiting for someone else to see it. And as she looked at Victoria, really looked at her, Margaret realized that the woman sitting across from her was no longer just someone she had welcomed into her family. She was someone who had been standing between her and her own life for far longer than she had ever imagined, and now that barrier was beginning to crack. Margaret allowed the silence to stretch, not out of hesitation but out of understanding, because she had lived long enough to know that people often revealed more in what they did not say than in what they did. And as she sat there watching the subtle shifts in both Daniel and Victoria, her mind drifted backward, not in confusion but in clarity, revisiting moments that had once seemed harmless but now carried a different weight. She remembered the afternoon Daniel had called her 2 years ago. His voice warm and excited as he spoke about wanting to make sure she was comfortable, about setting things up so she would not have to worry anymore. She had smiled during that call, standing by the small kitchen window of her apartment, looking out at the narrow street below, feeling a quiet sense of relief she had not allowed herself to fully express. But the call had ended quickly when Victoria's voice had come through in the background, reminding Daniel about an appointment, and afterward, when Margaret had tried to follow up, it was always Victoria who answered, always polite, always reassuring, always just a little too efficient at ending the conversation before it could go anywhere meaningful. She remembered the envelope she had waited for, checking her mailbox every afternoon for weeks, then months, until eventually she had stopped looking altogether, telling herself it must not have been as important as she had thought, that perhaps she had misunderstood. And there had been other moments too, smaller ones, like the time she had mentioned needing help with a repair and Victoria had gently suggested it might be better for Margaret to learn to manage within her means. The words had been said kindly, almost thoughtfully, but now, they echoed differently in her mind, carrying a tone she had not recognized before. A quiet dismissal disguised as concern. Margaret returned her focus to the present, her eyes steady on Victoria, who now seemed more guarded, her posture straighter, her movements more deliberate, as if she were carefully controlling every gesture. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders visible. There has to be an explanation that makes sense, he said, though his voice lacked the confidence it had held earlier. Margaret inclined her head slightly, her voice calm, and even when she finally spoke again, there is always an explanation, Daniel, she said, her words measured, leaving just enough space for meaning to settle between them. Victoria shifted in her seat, her gaze flickering briefly toward the hallway as if considering an escape, then back to the table. Maybe we should not jump to conclusions, she said, her tone smooth but edged now with something firmer, something defensive. Margaret did not respond immediately. Instead she observed the way Victoria's composure had become more rigid, less natural, and in that rigidity, Margaret saw confirmation of what she had already begun to understand. This was not confusion. This was not a misunderstanding. This was something constructed, something maintained over time. And now, under the weight of simple questions, it was beginning to strain. Daniel looked between them, caught in the space between doubt and realization, and Margaret felt a quiet shift within herself, a transition from uncertainty to clarity, because she was no longer piecing together fragments. She was seeing the full shape of what had been hidden from her. And for the first time, she was not simply reacting to what was happening around her. She was preparing for what would come next. Her hands resting calmly in her lap, her posture composed, her gaze unwavering. As the truth moved closer to the surface with every passing second, Daniel pushed his chair back slightly, the soft scrape against the floor breaking the stillness that had settled over the room. His eyes no longer scanning his phone but fixed now on Victoria with a focus that had shifted from confusion to something far more deliberate. "I need you to walk me through this," he said, his voice steady but firm, each word chosen with care as if he were stepping into unfamiliar territory. Victoria straightened in her seat, her expression composed but her shoulders held just a little too rigid. "There is nothing to walk through, Daniel. Everything was handled properly," she replied, her tone controlled. But there was a sharpness beneath it now, a defensive edge that had not been there before. Margaret remained silent, her presence calm and anchored, watching the exchange unfold without interruption, because she understood that this moment did not belong to her to control. It belonged to the truth finding its way into the open. Daniel did not look away. "Then explain why my mother has been living like she has nothing," he said, the words quieter now but carrying more weight. Victoria's gaze flickered again, not toward Margaret this time, but toward the kitchen, toward the hallway, anywhere but directly at him. Maybe she did not check the right account or maybe something was misdirected. She offered, her explanation thinner now, less certain. Daniel shook his head slowly. "No, that does not fit. Everything was set up clearly. There are confirmations, routing numbers, addresses. All of it matches what we discussed," he said, his voice tightening slightly as the gap between what should have happened and what did happen became impossible to ignore. Margaret felt a quiet shift in the air, not loud or dramatic, but unmistakable, the kind of shift that happens when a question turns into an answer. She folded her hands more firmly in her lap, her posture unchanged, but her awareness sharpened. Victoria let out a breath that was almost a sigh, though she tried to disguise it. "Daniel, you are overthinking this. These things happen more often than you think," she said. But the smooth confidence she had carried earlier was no longer fully intact. It wavered, just slightly, just enough. Daniel leaned forward now, resting his hands on the table, his attention unwavering. "Not for 2 years, Victoria," he said quietly, and in that quiet, there was something final beginning to take shape. Margaret observed the subtle tightening of Victoria's jaw, the way her fingers pressed more firmly against the glass in her hand, the way her breathing had become just a touch more controlled. These were not the signs of someone confused by an unfortunate mistake. These were the signs of someone calculating how much longer something could be held together. Margaret's eyes softened slightly, not with sympathy, but with recognition, because she had spent a lifetime reading people, understanding what was said and what was left unsaid. And now there was very little left unsaid. Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning back just enough to create a small distance, as if giving himself space to think. "I am going to call the bank in the morning," he said, more to himself than to either of them, but the words landed heavily in the room. Victoria's reaction was immediate, though subtle. Her eyes widened just a fraction before she quickly masked it, offering a small, controlled smile. "Of course, that is a good idea. They can clear everything up," she said. But the timing of her response, the slight hesitation before it, did not go unnoticed. Margaret saw it clearly, and in that moment, the last pieces fell into place, not as a sudden revelation, but as a quiet confirmation of everything she had already begun to understand. She did not speak. She did not need to, because the truth was no longer something hidden beneath the surface. It was there, present in every glance, every word, every pause. And as she sat there, composed and steady, Margaret realized that what had been taken from her was not just money or comfort. It was time, trust, and a sense of security she had believed was intact. But now, as the room settled into a new and heavier silence, she also understood something else, something just as important, that the moment of not knowing was over, and what came next would not be decided by silence anymore. The room did not return to normal after Daniel spoke about calling the bank. Instead, it settled into a quieter, heavier version of itself, as if something invisible had shifted permanently. Margaret remained seated with her hands resting calmly in her lap, but her attention was sharper now, focused not on what was being said, but on what was happening beneath it. Victoria rose from her chair with a smooth, controlled motion, the kind that suggested intention rather than impulse. "I think I need to step out for a moment and take a call," she said, her voice steady, but there was a tightness in it that had not been there earlier. Daniel looked up immediately, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Now?" he asked, not accusing, but no longer neutral. Victoria gave a small nod, already reaching for her phone. "It will only take a minute," she replied, but she did not wait for his response before turning toward the hallway. Her steps measured, almost too measured, as though she were aware of being watched. Margaret followed her movement with her eyes, noting the way Victoria's shoulders were held just a fraction higher than before, the way her pace was controlled but not relaxed. And in that small departure from ease, Margaret saw confirmation of what had been building all evening. Daniel remained seated for a moment, then stood as well, though he did not follow immediately. Instead, he ran a hand across his face, exhaling slowly, as if trying to organize his thoughts into something manageable. "This does not make any sense," he said quietly, more to himself than to Margaret, but she heard the shift in his tone, the loss of certainty, the beginning of something else, something more questioning. Margaret lifted her gaze to him, her expression calm, her voice even when she responded. "Sometimes things make sense only after you stop assuming they were done the right way," she said, her words gentle but precise. Daniel looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing something he had overlooked before, not just in the situation, but in her, in the quiet strength she carried without ever needing to announce it. The house felt different now, the earlier warmth replaced by a stillness that carried weight. From down the hallway came the faint murmur of Victoria's voice, low and controlled, though the words could not be made out. Margaret listened without appearing to listen, her focus not on the content, but on the presence of it, the urgency beneath the calm tone. Daniel glanced toward the hallway, his jaw tightening slightly, then back at his phone, as if searching for something else, something he might have missed. Margaret watched him for a moment, then lowered her gaze again, not in retreat, but in reflection, because she understood that this moment was no longer about proving anything. It was about allowing the truth to reveal itself fully, without interruption, without interference. And as she sat there, composed and steady, she realized that the balance in the room had shifted, not dramatically, not with raised voices or sudden accusations, but in a quieter, more powerful way. The uncertainty that had once belonged to her now rested elsewhere, and the calm she carried was no longer the calm of someone unsure. It was the calm of someone who had begun to see clearly, and who was prepared to let that clarity unfold, no matter where it led. Margaret remained seated long after Victoria's voice faded into the background, her gaze resting on the surface of the table, as if she were looking at something far beyond it, because now that the pieces had begun to align, her mind continued to move through the past with a quiet, relentless clarity. She remembered the first time Victoria had gently suggested that Daniel was too busy to visit as often, how it had been framed as concern, as consideration for his demanding schedule, and Margaret had accepted it without hesitation, proud of her son, unwilling to be a burden. She remembered the holidays that had slowly changed over the years, invitations becoming less frequent, gatherings becoming shorter, conversations more superficial, always with reasonable explanations, always with a tone that discouraged further questions. She remembered the way Victoria had taken control of small things at first, organizing schedules, managing calls, handling mail, things that seemed helpful, even thoughtful, until Margaret realized that those small controls had quietly grown into something larger, something that placed Victoria between her and Daniel in ways she had not fully understood at the time. Daniel shifted slightly across from her, still holding his phone but no longer looking at it. His attention now turned inward, replaying his own version of the past. Margaret could see it in his expression, the slow recalibration of memory, the reconsideration of details that once felt ordinary. She always said you were doing fine, he murmured, almost to himself, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that had not been there before. Margaret lifted her eyes to him, her expression unchanged, but her silence inviting him to continue. Every time I asked, she said you had everything you needed, that you preferred your independence. He added, his words slower now, as if each one required more effort than the last. Margaret inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without interrupting it, because she understood that this realization needed to belong to him, not be given to him. From the hallway came the soft sound of a door closing, followed by silence, and then Victoria's footsteps returning, measured and composed once again, but not quite as effortless as before. She re-entered the room with a small, controlled smile, taking her seat as if nothing had shifted, as if the conversation had simply paused rather than transformed. Everything is fine, she said lightly, though no one had asked, and in that unnecessary reassurance, Margaret heard more than the words themselves. Daniel looked at her, not with immediate accusation, but with something more searching, more deliberate. Who handled the account setup? He asked, his tone calm but focused. Victoria met his gaze, holding it just long enough to appear steady. I coordinated the details, like I told you earlier, she replied, her voice smooth, but the slight delay before her answer lingered in the space between them. Margaret watched quietly, her attention fixed not on the content of the exchange, but on its rhythm, the pauses, the shifts, the subtle tension that had replaced ease, and in that rhythm, she saw the final confirmation of what she had already understood. This was not a misunderstanding unraveling. This was a constructed reality beginning to collapse under the weight of simple truth. And as she sat there, composed and silent, Margaret realized that the story she had been living for the past 2 years was not the one she had believed. And now, as that false version fell away piece by piece, what remained was not confusion, but clarity. And with that clarity came something she had not felt in a long time. Not anger, not regret, but a quiet, steady sense of control returning to her, one moment at a time. Daniel did not look away this time. His gaze fixed steadily on Victoria, as if he had finally reached a point where looking elsewhere was no longer an option. The hesitation that had colored his earlier questions now replaced by something firmer, something that carried weight. Which account was used for the transfers? He asked, his voice calm but precise, each word landing clearly in the quiet room. Victoria's smile remained in place for a moment too long before she answered. The one we discussed. Daniel. Everything was set up exactly as planned, she said. But the ease she tried to project no longer matched the tension in her posture. Margaret observed the exchange without moving, her presence steady, her silence no longer passive but intentional, because she understood that the truth was no longer something that needed to be pulled forward. It was already pressing outward on its own. Daniel nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the answer while at the same time measuring it against something else. Something internal. Then there should be a receiving account tied to Mom's name. He continued, lifting his phone again, his fingers moving with renewed purpose. But there is not. Everything routes through the same intermediary account before being marked as completed, he said, his voice tightening slightly as he read. Victoria's hand paused mid-motion, the glass in her fingers hovering just above the table before she set it down carefully. That is standard processing. Sometimes banks use intermediary steps, she replied quickly, but the speed of her response betrayed the control she was trying to maintain. Daniel's eyes lifted from the screen to her face, and this time there was no confusion in his expression, only focus. For 1 or 2 transactions, maybe, but not for every single one over 2 years, he said, the calm in his tone now edged with something sharper. Something that no longer allowed easy explanations to pass without challenge. The room seemed to contract. Slightly around them, the air heavier, more defined. Margaret felt the shift clearly, not as something sudden, but as the natural result of everything that had been building. She remained still, her gaze steady, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption. Victoria's composure faltered for the briefest second, her eyes dropping before she forced them back up. her shoulders straightening as if she could regain control through posture alone. "You are reading too much into this," she said. But the words lacked the confidence they once carried. Daniel shook his head once. Slowly. "No. I am finally reading it clearly," he replied. His voice quiet but resolute. And in that quiet, something definitive settled into place. Margaret watched as the distance between them shifted. Not physically, but in something less visible and far more important. The space of assumption and trust that had once existed now replaced by scrutiny and doubt. Victoria inhaled slowly, her breath controlled, her expression carefully neutral. But Margaret saw the strain beneath it, the effort required to hold that neutrality together. And it was in that effort that the truth became undeniable, not because it had been spoken directly, but because it could no longer be hidden convincingly. Daniel lowered his phone, his hand still now, his gaze unwavering, and Margaret understood that the moment they had been moving toward had arrived, not with raised voices or dramatic declarations, but with something quieter and far more final, the absence of believable denial. And as she sat there, composed and silent, she knew that whatever came next would not return things to what they had been, because the version of reality that had allowed this to continue had already begun to fall apart, leaving behind only what was real, and what was real could no longer be ignored. The silence that followed Daniel's last words did not feel uncertain anymore, felt settled, like something that had been building for a long time had finally reached its natural conclusion. Margaret remained still, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her posture unchanged, but there was a quiet shift in her presence that could not be ignored, not even by Daniel, who now looked at her with a different kind of attention, one that carried both realization and regret. Victoria's composure held for a moment longer, her expression carefully neutral, but the effort behind it was visible now, unmistakable in the slight tension around her eyes, the controlled rhythm of her breathing, the way her fingers pressed against the edge of the table as if grounding herself. "Daniel, we are making this more complicated than it needs to be," she said finally, her voice softer now, almost persuasive, as though she were trying to guide the conversation back into something manageable, something familiar. But Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked down at the phone in his hand, then back at her, his expression no longer searching, no longer uncertain, but resolved in a way that changed the space between them. "No, Victoria," he said quietly. "We made it complicated by not asking the right questions sooner." The words were not raised, not sharp, but they carried weight in their clarity, and for the first time, Victoria did not respond right away. The pause that followed was longer than any before, and in that pause, Margaret understood that the last layer of denial had fallen away. She shifted slightly in her chair, not to interrupt, but to acknowledge the moment, her voice calm when she finally spoke. "It is not about what should have happened," she said, her tone steady and even. "It is about what did happen." Daniel's gaze moved to her, and in that moment, there was something in his expression that had not been there earlier, something that resembled understanding, not just of the situation, but of her, of what she had endured without complaint, without accusation. Victoria exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just slightly as if the effort of maintaining control had begun to wear thin. She glanced between them, then looked down briefly before lifting her eyes again. But this time, the confidence that had defined her earlier was gone, replaced by something quieter, something that did not attempt to dominate the room. Margaret did not press further. She did not demand answers or explanations, because she understood that the shift had already occurred. The balance of the room had changed, not through confrontation, but through clarity. Daniel straightened, setting his phone down on the table with a controlled motion. "We will review everything tomorrow," he said, his voice firm, leaving little room for interpretation. Victoria nodded once, a small, restrained movement, and in that nod, there was an acceptance that had not been present before, not of guilt spoken aloud, but of a reality that could no longer be redirected or softened. Margaret rose slowly from her chair, her movements unhurried, composed, as if she were stepping out of something that no longer held power over her. She looked at Daniel for a brief moment, her expression calm, then turned toward the door, not waiting for anything further, because she knew that what needed to be seen had already been seen, and as she walked away from the table, there was no heaviness in her steps,
no hesitación,
only a quiet certainty, the kind that comes not from being given answers, but from recognizing the truth when it finally stands clear. And for the first time in a long while, Margaret was not leaving with questions, she was leaving with understanding, and that understanding was enough.